Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Sadlier. I'm not sure if you were at the last first workshop, so that was about kind of the nuts and bolts of academic writing. This one is going to be more about critical thinking skills, which is really, really important as you go about writing your dissertation. It's kind of the next level up from just knowing the basics of academic writing. So hopefully you'll find this session useful for your thesis when you're writing it. So there's a number of learning outcomes for this workshop. So first, to examine our reading practices and to think about how these can be improved to maximize learning. Secondly, to define critical thinking and its importance within academic writing. And then finally, to examine a notable case study from the peer-reviewed literature, as well as responses to this case study. So to highlight the importance of critical thinking skills. So those would have been the articles that were sent out to you with this invitation, which hopefully you managed to have a look at. Now, first, we're going to have a little bit of a look at reading practices. So when you're reading materials for your thesis, there are a number of questions you need to ask. So some of these would include, what is required of this thesis? Why am I reading this text? And what do I want to get out of it? So you need a kind of rationale for why you're reading a particular text. And also a very personal question, what is my concentration span? So how can I adapt my reading practices accordingly? So this is very different according to different people. For instance, some people can sit down and concentrate on reading for much longer and are able to do that, while others, and especially in this era where we're all constantly on our phones and flicking between apps, I think our concentration span has generally got much less. So how can I adapt my reading practices accordingly? So according to your own style of engagement with reading and how long you can concentrate, because that is really important to know. How can I write more effective notes? So note-taking is a really, really important aspect of, critical thinking, really, because when you're reading a text, you need to go through and just, think to yourself, oh, what are the key points? What do I think about this text, etc., etc. So those are some things to think about when you're reading texts. So about reading practices. A key question we're always asked is like how to find relevant texts. There are a number of ways you can do this. So library databases offer the most useful and trustworthy source. So yeah, like you have the whole University of Plymouth library at your disposal. So I would advise you to use that as much as possible. And Google Scholar, it may seem useful, but yeah, it does not always have good quality sources listed. So you have to be a bit mindful of what you look at online, although you can find some useful articles via Google Scholar with some PDFs, available automatically. I would say do not cite Wikipedia. This is a good port of call for introducing a topic and identifying broader readings, but not as a source in itself. So if you want to look up a topic and you find a Wikipedia entry on it, that's fine. And you get loads of links to relevant sources. However, I wouldn't use that, I wouldn't cite the Wikipedia page itself. Rather, you should just maybe look at some of the readings that are suggested on the Wikipedia page and then use that as a basis for further exploration. Now, there is a video on your TLP, I think, that I created about a year ago, which shows you how to search for sources. So how to use kind of advanced search tools like keywords, chronological tools, and other advanced search tools for using the library database. So you should have a look at that video if you want to know a bit more about how you approach it. So there are a number of reading strategies you can use. Two main ones, actually. I think the first one I would call skimming and scanning. In this approach, really, it's about, reading the abstract and conclusion of a piece of work, which are the key parts of most journal articles, I suppose, and have a quick look through the rest of the text, but you don't need to look in detail. And then this can really be referred to as, getting the gist of a topic, getting an idea about the topic. So you're getting a general idea, basically. So it's not about detailed reading, this approach. It's about getting a general idea of the paper you're reading. And this differs quite a lot to, another strategy, which is kind of called critical reading, which is kind of what I'm trying to emphasize today. Now, critical reading, basically, this is very different than the skim and scan approach, because you're reading through the text, underlining or highlighting key parts, or you can put post-it notes on relevant sections as well. So it's a more kind of engaged form of reading, where you're actually kind of really thinking about what the knowledge claims are in a particular text. So yeah, critical reading is quite different in that way. You can write some brief notes to summarize the key points, but it has to be in your own words. I would emphasize that really clearly, because sometimes, when you try to do critical reading, you read through a text and you end up just kind of taking down almost word for word what the author has written, which is not really a good idea, because when it comes to writing your own text, you'll end up basically plagiarizing the author. So I really have to emphasize, when you're taking critical notes, you really need to write in your own words. So you're paraphrasing in other words. That's a really important thing to take into account. And as well as summarizing what, the text is about, you need to add a few sentences of critical reflection. So what are the particular strengths and weaknesses of this particular source that you are reading? So it's both a description and analysis in one. Just very brief, short points, like bullet points almost. I will show you later on some critical notes I made about, the articles that we're going to discuss later. So hopefully that is clear. Skimming and scanning is about getting an idea about a text. Critical reading is about a deeper level of engagement with the text, where you're taking critical notes, and you're being more analytical, basically. A key message I would say in this workshop is do not keep reading forever. There's always a temptation, when you get into a topic and you're quite enjoying it, is just I'll keep reading and reading and reading, and eventually I'll get to some core idea. But that's not really a good approach, because then you'll just end up feeling quite confused and not really knowing, what your central argument or claim is. So I would recommend really, being very strategic about what texts you look at. Don't read reams and reams and reams of text, but find out what are the ones that are most relevant, read them, and do your critical analysis. Because ultimately a literature review section will be quite short in the end, and you need to get to what the core of your own topic is. So I think that's an important point. A useful exercise, if you can do this, is to summarize the key argument or idea of your thesis in, say, 1 to 3 sentences. So basically, if you're able to summarize it very, very clearly, it's almost like an elevator pitch. For instance, if you're trying to get something published, where you pitch to a publisher, although you're not doing that, but it's the same thing. If you can say something very concisely, what your key idea is and why it's important, then you're probably going to have quite a good thesis. Obviously, there'll be some work involved, but at least you'll have, a clear idea and you know where you're going. So do try that exercise in your own time to see if you can really formulate a clear thesis statement. Now, you might be asking, and this is an important question because, there's often a lot of definitions thrown about this topic. What is critical thinking? And that is an important question, because there are some kind of, slightly different definitions. But Broadly speaking, it's fair to say that there are two levels of engagement with the text. These would be description and analysis. Now, one of the pitfalls of academic writing is engaging too much with the level of description. As researchers, we must also evaluate a source's biases, strengths, and limitations. So we should assess how our research fills a lacuna in the existing literature. Critical thinking engages with the but why and the so what questions. It involves a constant process of questioning. So think of a child nagging its mother about something that seems commonplace. So it's like the child saying, but why? Why is it this way? That's the sort of question you need to be asking yourself constantly. But why? And so what? You know, it's like you can write and describe a text and say, you know, but unless, you know, you're writing in such a way that, you know, your topic, you have to explain why it is important. And otherwise, like the text you write will just be a description of a topic, and that's not what a thesis is. So those core questions need to be taken into account basically as you write your thesis. So basically, critical thinking embraces complexity. No knowledge claims are ever complete. I think we'll discuss that later in relation to the articles that were sent out with this invitation. So in summary, really, critical thinking is the ability to reflect skeptically and the ability to think in a logical way. So it's about skepticism and logic as well, so that the argument flows clearly. So you may or may not have heard of this, but it's called Bloom's taxonomy. It's, you know, there are many flaws of this model because Bloom sort of suggested that you have to work through these stages almost, whereas we should really be encouraged to, you know, always engage first with the upper layers, really. It's not just about understanding something, but we always need to analyze, evaluate it, and if possible, create a new theory about something, which is essentially what you get to at PhD level. So this is basically a model for understanding critical thinking and the different levels of thinking, because, you know, we start from the lower levels, which are about remembering, understanding, and we go up to the higher levels of thinking, which was about analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And really, you want to be thinking about the upper layers much more than the lower ones. Unfortunately, in my own schooling experience, when I was much younger, you know, it was all about recalling and remembering stuff, and it wasn't, you know, until you get to postgrad level almost that you really get to the upper levels, which is unfortunate. I know there are like educational systems that are more emphasizing the upper levels, which is good, but it's not always done that way, which is unfortunate. So yeah, Bloom had this taxonomy and he dealt with 3 different levels, so cognitive, affective, and sensory. The one on the previous diagram was related to cognitive dimension. And as I said, remembering and understanding are too often emphasized in traditional educational approaches. Sometimes you do need to just understand and remember information, say, you know, multiple choice questions can be useful to check for understanding. But when you're writing a thesis, it is about, you know, getting to the deeper layers of analysis, essentially. Another key question we can ask is a source always valid? Now, one type of source is like a website source. So, you know, it can be relevant to your topic. We have to ask important questions like, is it being funded by a company with a particular ethos? Is it biased and subject to a conflict of interest? So those are some core questions you need to ask whenever you look at sources you just find online. You know, is a source always valid? So peer-reviewed journal articles, there is seemingly the gold standard of the type of material you should be looking at when you're researching for a thesis. Because the researcher's work is heavily critiqued, it goes through a peer review process. So, double-blinded peer review where your work is submitted anonymously to reviewers and they give critique, and it's, accepted or not for various reasons, and you have to make edits based on that. But it's important to highlight also that, sometimes journals can have vested interests, and to use an analogy, poisoned fish can slip through the net. I think this is, shown clearly in the example that we have today. So yeah, it's always important to critique what you read, essentially. Which brings me on to the critical thinking exercise that we're going to look at. So I hope you've managed to have some kind of a look at the two articles that were sent through with this invitation. One was by Bruce Gilley, a highly controversial article, and the other was by Rodriguez, which was like a response to that article about the topic of colonialism. I know it's not directly related in any way to the maritime industry, but one thing it's important to highlight, it's good to kind of think across disciplines. And to be able to apply critical thinking skills to any example. So hopefully this example, since that topic is something that affects many people worldwide, will be a good topic to discuss today. So the key questions, and this was sent out as well with the workshop invitation, was what are the key issues with Gilley's article, if any? Do you agree with Rodriguez's critique? If so, why? So you need to, again, that's the critical question, why? You need to be able to explain why. What does Gilley's article, which passed peer review, reveal to us about the importance of viewing all academic literature with a critical eye? And finally, what do the multifaceted responses to Gilley's article reveal about the state of knowledge? So there was a link also in the document that was sent to an open democracy letter that lots of academics signed in response to Gilley's article. So I hope you managed to have a look at that as well. So I can't see you at the moment, so I hope you're doing all right. Give me a thumbs up or something. I'm going to give you a few minutes, so I hope you both have access to the articles and the exercise that was sent out with the open democracy link as well. Do you have that?
Okay, I've got two articles. One is a case against
exactly.
colonialism.
And then there was another document with these questions on it, basically, and I had a link to open democracy on that as well. It was just a Word document. There was just responses, like at the bottom, there were some responses that people had to the article, etc. But anyway, I'll share that on the screen afterwards. So and Sanjaya, I don't know if you've managed to read them. Hopefully you've had a look through, but we have time, so I'm going to give you, there's actually plenty of time, so I can even have like 10 minutes to look through so that you have plenty of time to discuss. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a bit more things to discuss if you have more time to look through. Okay, great. I'll leave you for up to 10 minutes then to look back through those and to put your thoughts together about these questions. And then, yeah, we'll come back and discuss for about 10 minutes or something. And then I have a few extra slides at the end. Hopefully that's okay. Great, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Hopefully you're getting on okay. We'll discuss in just another couple of minutes, maybe. Also, if you want to write anything in the chat box, feel free to as well. Okay, let's leave it there. So just looking at these questions then and what you read, what are your thoughts generally on the articles and these questions? Feel free to share.
I find it's the two sides of colonialism. One is a good side, and on the other is bad side of it. So one is some type of colonialism has left countries like Singapore to prosperous. At least they have emulated uh, the the rule of law and the economy wise, and so it has developed. But some part of the countries has been left devastated. They need to be recolonized, and they need to have a jump start of kind of economic boom to at least have a proper quality life, I would say.
Yeah, so
As per my understanding, yeah.
what do you think about Gilly's argument and what do you think about Rodriguez's critique? So that was a general idea about the topics under exploration, but what do you think about their specific arguments?
I would say good and bad because I've seen colonialism. I'm part of the country that I was colonized as well. I'm from Malaysia, so it was a British colony.
Yeah.
So we never had any bloodshed. We never shed blood to gain the independence in 1957. It was just given. So then we just started developing. The economies just developed, and then we are still under the British law and the education system. So we have a good kind of development from the post-colonial era. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't say it's
So
bad.
what do you think, though, about what Gilly specifically says in the article about colonialism? What do you think of his perspective on it? Do you agree or disagree? What do you think of, what Rodriguez says in her article?
I agree. I agree with this argument.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, but
Why
that's
though?
what I've.
Why? What is the reason you do agree?
I haven't finished the whole article, but what I've read through.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But you need to ask yourself why you agree with something. So, well, there are different opinions, and there are people that ended up supporting Gilly in some ways, but for me, what the major problem with Gilly's article is that he does not think of all the horrible things that colonialism has done to many people worldwide in different cultures. Okay, there are some
Yeah.
good aspects in terms of like sometimes, you know, there's good things that come out of the intermingling of cultures, for instance.
Yep.
But when you think about what colonialism has actually done to, you know, whole groups of people, I'll talk about it a bit in a minute, but I did a lot of work in East Timor before. So
Yeah, that's why I started with has the bad and good side of it. So
right.
I can see the bad side as well.
Yeah, okay. So what do you think then Gilly fails to look at in his article that he should have looked at?
They especially certain countries like my neighboring countries like Indonesia and so on, they have exhausted resources and which has been exploited.
Mm,
So they are not as same as what our colonial past has done. So that's what I'm saying. So there are certain part of the countries which have been colonized. They've been through a very dark history,
yeah, for
and
sure.
yeah, a lot of like ethnic cleansings and so on has happened. So
Yeah. One thing I find difficult with the Gilly thing is it almost like fails to critique the issues with, you know, Europe being the epicenter of the world. Almost
yeah,
like, you know, it's almost like a case. You know, I think Rodriguez said it there in her article. It's almost like a case, should have been called a case for Western imperialism or European centric, you know,
yep,
colonialism.
yep,
Like, because there are
yep, yep,
major
yep.
issues with that, with taking Europe as the center of the world almost, you know, which so often it becomes
Yes,
that way, you know.
yes. Um, uh, like I said, I wouldn't agree that what
Yeah.
Gilly has said. It just the whole of Europe has been built with certain type of colonialism,
Mm,
which you
mm,
have got the resources from other part of the world. But
yeah.
when you have left them without uh, any guidance, and they have to start, you know, it's like a chaotic
Yeah.
world. You
Yeah.
just build a chaotic world from what they were, and after that,
I completely agree with that. Yeah, because you know, I just keep thinking of East Timor because it was like such a interesting place to do some research work in. But when you think about it, they had, you know, basically two colonial regimes almost straight after one another. There was 9 days of independence. That was all they had,
yep,
and then they were basically first Portugal and then Indonesia, and just a bloody dictator.
yes,
And then
yes,
also at the same time, Australia took all its oil resources and it was only returned in 2018. So
yes,
and
yes, yes.
no, there's like constant changes of government there. I haven't actually been
Okay.
following recently what's going on, but it just seems like very chaotic, and it's been like that since they got independence back in 2002 or something.
Yeah.
But it's like you have to ask the question, like, how can people self-govern if all they've ever known is being plundered and exploited from the very beginning of time? That is
Yes.
my question.
But there's another argument here that okay, the reason colonial uh, country was, but who gained independence, but I wouldn't say it's like independence, it was returned back to China, was Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So I think Hong Kong, it was not a bad at all. They were in the British, I think it's the 1990s or something, and they returned back to China. I think people didn't agree on that.
Yeah.
So that another part of post-colonial era, that people wouldn't want to get into the communism. They still want to have that democracy, but still they can't work it out until today.
Yeah. And then Sanjaya, do you have any insights or thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I went through the article, and my idea is Gili look like express his own idea, and it would be better if he can come with some example. Probably he has thought about a couple of countries who had the benefit with the colonialism, but rest of the world, many Asian countries, they lost their regime and proud and economy. And probably he has thought about a few countries where in Europe, but not taking like example all around the world. So he tried to emphasize his own ideology.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Definitely agree. Yeah. And then the other part of this question really is, like, this article kind of got through peer review originally. It's very questionable as to how it did. Some people say, and I don't know if there's a definite conclusion on this, but that the reviewers initially rejected it, but the editor said, oh no, we're going to put this through, partly because of publicity reasons. So if people click on this controversial article, they'll get more and more clicks, they get a bigger impact factor. And this in itself is an ethical issue, I would say. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, and on the whole idea of peer review, since it's meant to be, the gold standard, more or less.
Yes, agree on the peer review. It has to go through certain type of process.
Yeah.
Like, okay, since I'm an engineer, so like we do procedures, we have to go through a certain processes. It means we have to do the procedures, has to go for a first review, a second review, third review, and then it comes for an approval. So we have a revision A, B, C, and then issued for approval, IFA, and then approved for construction. Let's say this is just an example. So this is where they get all these ideas. When you come up with the first article, let's say one first procedure, they're not going to be perfect. So a lot of things, argument comes there, and then we have a review session with the fellow engineers from, let's say, party A, party B, and so on. So then it will be fine-tuned until it is approved. It is perfect. I would say it's perfect.
Yeah.
So that's what probably is missing here.
Yeah. It was very questionable what actually went on, because there's different things we hear, but generally speaking, the whole thing wasn't very transparent. And that's, supposedly it wasn't actually passed by all the reviewers originally, but still the editor went through with it. So it's very controversial, especially on, they knew it was going to be a controversial topic. It's like clicks, like people are going to click on this. I think you'll see from all the responses, actually I might share, I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a moment, and I'm going to try sharing, let me see, this. So this was like the open letter that I included within the questions document that was sent out. But you'll see at the bottom here, there's so much like conflicting opinions. And it just shows like, we really need to critique everything we read. Because you'll see all sorts of things here. There's people who are really like polarized on the topic. Gilly's work is well reasoned, and then I disagree, to put it mildly. But I'm deliberately avoiding getting into these topics. Yeah, so there's a whole range of beliefs and internal beliefs, and that's why we need to critique everything we read, really. No knowledge claims are ever complete. Would you like as well to see an example of critical notes? So this is an example of some critical notes I wrote myself on Gillies and Rodriguez's article, just so you can get an idea of how you would write critical notes on any text, basically, that you're going through. So yes, critical, I think it's this one. Oh no, this one. Basically, yeah. This, I've just taken some notes as if I was writing this myself, having gone through the articles, and then I'm going to write a paper myself on it. So this is how you can write critical notes. You have say you write about the issues with Gilly, the counter argument of Rodriguez, and the issues with the journal itself. So I think some of the main things I was highlighting here when I was reading through, but this is just my opinion, is, Gilly does not critique the very foundations of colonialism, like the actual impact of invading and plundering a population and its land. So basically he's legitimizing it, by evading those core topics that you need to look at. He thinks people of colonized countries cannot self-govern, but that does not consider what colonialism does to people. So as I mentioned there, the example of East Timor, very tragic history. And then you ask people to self-govern. There was a civil war, because of sort of relationships that were set up between people, fighting relationships during the Portuguese era, which was back centuries and centuries ago. And this led to civil war later. So you can't exactly say, these people cannot self-govern. There's a whole history and a reason why that happened. And it's kind of irresponsible of him to not examine this a bit deeper.
The self-governing only can start when you have given the empowerment. They have to have that basic and education and empowerment. They can't self-govern.
Exactly, I agree. And the first question I'm always asked when, I said I did some work in East Timor is like, where's East Timor? It's like, because we have a very skewed worldview. It's like a very Eurocentric worldview. So we kind of, especially people in Europe and the West, they kind of can't think outside that worldview because, so it's skewed essentially. So there are some issues with Gilly. As I mentioned earlier, I think Rodriguez said this should really have been called a case for European or Western colonialism, because that's essentially what he's focusing on. Supposed superiority of Europe and the West, which obviously is not true. Like, I often think, what if subjugated people who have their own indigenous cultural traditions or whatever, what if they if they were the ones, not that had plundered, but if their worldviews were actually the ones that were at the core of society, how would society be different? It's just an interesting thought experiment. The main issue that like Rodriguez highlights, and I think this is important, is it's not so much that Gilly tried to make an argument for colonialism. Essentially, you are free to kind of critique anything in academic writing if you have enough knowledge base for doing that. But the main thing is it's like you said there actually, Sandrea, if he put forward a certain ideology, it was a certain perspective and lens, and that was like really dogmatic, and he didn't actually do very much critical thinking in this article, I think, which is kind of the whole topic of this. There are many things he failed to overlook, like political systems like capitalism, neoliberalism, larger disparities between rich and poor, which are increasing, indigenous knowledge systems. What if these were the core of development, not Eurocentric values? And then the journal itself, as we mentioned, there was issues with the content and the editorial process. Did it actually go through peer review? Don't know. It's questionable. Was it about getting more clicks, improving the impact factor? It's quite likely. Lack of transparency. And in fact, I don't know if you've read more about these articles, but the whole editorial board resigned because they received death threats. This was all totally preventable, by the way. And then my last question is, should we ever really debate really contentious topics like colonialism? I know there I said, if there's enough knowledge base and literature that you can critique, maybe, but something leaves me feeling that's kind of fundamentally wrong in some way. Like, what are the limits of knowledge then? Don't know if you have any thoughts on all that. They're my critical notes I wrote when I was reading through these. Of course, they're just my thoughts, but this is what I would encourage you to do when you're reading through any text for your thesis, to do these sort of notes. It's only one page, that's all, on 2 articles. But it's a good way. And then you can make these bullet points actually into, whole paragraphs of text. And okay. Have you any final thoughts on those case studies and on the topic and on the editorial process and blah, blah?
as we discussed, it has not to be published at all in the first
Yeah.
place. So
Yeah.
it should have been, it should be a self censorship
Yeah. Yeah.
before releasing an article.
I think many people feel the same. It was retracted because of the death threats and all that. But actually, if you look online, if you're curious in finding out more about what happened since this was withdrawn in 2017, originally from Third World Quarterly, which was the journal, it was published actually the next year in another journal. I was just looking this up yesterday, a very, very conservative sort of journal. I can't remember its name now. But that said, oh, this is fine, we're going to publish this. And, there was another backlash. And just last year, Gilly wrote a critique, like an article that basically legitimated why he had written this and why everyone had gotten wrong. So I can always send that link on later if you can't find it, because it's very interesting to see, he was, still quite blindsided on many things. There are, of course, people who came to his defense. There was even Noam Chomsky, and I used to be quite a fan of him. I'm afraid now I'm not so sure. But yeah, if you want to read more about it, you'll find you'll find Gilly's updated version of why this article is still legitimate and why everyone misunderstood him. Anyway, it's a very
the damage is done.
It's a very interesting example because it just shows peer review is not always 100% gold standard. There are many articles that are essentially, masquerading opinion pieces that get published in peer-reviewed journals. It does not mean that, everything that gets in there is brilliant and wonderful and well-researched. Sometimes it depends on what reviewer you get, or just multiple circumstances involved. And I've gone through the publication process myself, so I know what, the academic publishing machine is like. It's not always a very pretty thing. And essentially, like, you'll end up, it's not even fair on, this is a different topic, but on researchers, because you're trying to get stuff published, and by the time you get an initial response, it's like 9 months or something, 9 months later, Yeah, and not always the best stuff gets through, and it depends on who you get as your reader and what their interests are, and they will ultimately shape your article. Which again brings in the whole topic of self-publishing. Some people are like, self-publishing isn't very good because, you're not going through a publisher and it's not getting that level of critique. But sometimes I'm like, traditional publishers, whether it's academic or non-academic text, will always shape your work in a certain way, which again, is that always great? That's another question. Well, I'm going to stop sharing this. I have a few more slides after this, but nothing that much extra. So we've done this exercise, which is great, and we had some good discussions there, so thanks for that. Some other key issues then, based on what we've just said. So the interests of the journal's editors and reviewers, they're always going to have certain interests, and they're going to go with that regardless. So your work is always going to be shaped in some shape or form. Are there any financial incentives involved? There could be, for instance, this was quite possibly about getting some extra likes and clicks and impact factor. I think without question there was something to do with that involved in this example. And just because a journal article has managed to get past peer review, this does not mean it's necessarily a trustworthy source. So I think we've come to that conclusion, and it's fair to say. So always critique what we read. I'd advise you to do that as you work through any literature you're reading. Just because it's in some fancy journal doesn't mean, it's gold standard. Okay, it might be very well researched and whatever, but it may not be either. Oh, so these are some nice examples if you want to look at them afterwards, because you can take down the link. They're examples of, 3 scholars in the US who wrote 20 fake papers using jargon. And I think in this example, out of about 20 papers they sent in, I think about half of them got through the initial peer review process, even though it was complete and utter junk. It was made up completely on all sorts of obscure topics. And still a lot of them got through the initial stage of peer review, which again just shows a lot, really, doesn't it? There's also these bogus scientific abstracts generated using software programs. This happens, you know, quite a lot of science journals, and they get it, like a lot of them get through, which is the funniest thing. For example, I've one example on this slide. This was actually an abstract of a fictional article by this person here. It was generated using a particular artificial intelligence program. And as you can see, it's just complete jargon, isn't it? But that managed to actually get published, I think, in some kind of conference booklet. And it's just ridiculous. Like, come on, Curd. Anyway, another example of why you should always, yeah.
SciGen is a kind of software, is it?
Yeah, a sort of software for automatically generating, you know, material.
Okay.
Oh, it's ridiculous. Like, come on. So my key take-home message then, regardless of whether a piece of literature has gone through a rigorous peer review, always critique its knowledge claims. That goes for anything you read, whether it's open access, fancy peer-reviewed journal, book chapter, or whatever it is. Yeah. They're all the references so that I consulted in creating this little workshop. And there's loads online if you want to read more about that particular Gilly case study. There's been so many critiques written, and you can find his response to it all that was written last year, 2021, trying to legitimate what he had written and all that. Yeah, that's me. That's my email address. I've updated it now, so you can email me afterwards if you have any further questions.
Okay.
Thank you for listening. It's been good. Had some good conversations. So there, I've stopped screen sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks. I hope it was useful, and I hope
Yep.
you can apply some of those techniques to whatever you're reading for your own thesis.
Definitely.
This is going to be on the forum afterwards, so if you want to look back at any of it, then you can do that because the recording will be up over the next few days.
Okay.
Great. So any
Thank
other
you.
questions before we leave?
No, thank you.
No? Okay, I hope it was useful anyway. Best of luck with your research journey, and yeah, if you have any questions, just email me and I'm happy to help.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
I'll leave you go.
Thank
So
you.
have a nice day wherever you are.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.